Okay, it's recording. So thanks to everyone joining. Thanks to Sam for coming to talk to us today. Sam is an associate professor of philosophy of science at the Centre for Science Studies and also affiliated with Aarhus University also. His work in the philosophy of science focuses on the relationship between theory and evidence, theory choice, prediction, explanation, and discovery, and all of his work in philosophy of science is heavily grounded in the history of science as a tool for that. And his book, Theoretical Virtues in Science, Uncovering Reality Through Theory, which came out in 2018, incorporates all of this. And James just says outstanding recent book, which I agree. So I'll hand over to you now, Sam, to start your talk.
Yeah. Thanks so much, and thanks for the invitation, especially David. Okay, so this is the title of the talk. I'm trying to get my clicker sorted. Okay. So yeah, theoretical virtues play a role in several areas in the philosophy of science, as you're all aware, I'm sure. The first maybe major contribution to the topic, or one of the most important ones at least, is Thomas Kuhn's objectively valued judgment and theory choice. And Kuhn, in that paper, he lists 5 virtues, which he calls values, or theory choice criteria: empirical accuracy, consistency, simplicity, scope, and fertility. And he doesn't claim that these are exhaustive, but he is very confident that these are some of the most important theoretical virtues that there are. And this is pretty much, I mean, since then, this is pretty much the list that people have been working with. I mean, there are some additions, but and some clarifications. So, for example, it makes a lot of sense to distinguish between internal and external consistency. But yeah, roughly this list has been with us ever since. In the realism debates, theoretical virtues have played a role with regards to the no miracles argument and the inference to the best explanation, where people argue about whether theoretical virtues such as simplicity should really play any role in our commitments to the truth of a theory or not. And more recently, in the inductive risk debate, where Heather Douglas has, which Heather Douglas has revived with her book. There's also a discussion about, or at least she talks about a lot, whether theoretical virtues such as simplicity should have an unification, whether they should actually influence our assessments of the evidence, and she denies that. And lastly, in discussions about laws of nature, Lewis' best system analysis, you have a striking of balance between simplicity and strength in determining the laws of nature. So yeah, just very briefly to emphasize that theoretical virtues have played a significant role in several debates in the philosophy of science. And yeah, so there are empirical ways of investigating theoretical virtues, and I've done some of that. I've done historical case studies. You can also focus, of course, on contemporary science. And I've done mostly historical stuff in my book, bit of formal work. So Samuel Kasha has a very nice paper, as you're all aware, on theory choice as well. And perhaps, yeah, even intuitions. I actually think that some of the discussions are driven by intuitions, which is perhaps not ideal. But yeah, so in this paper, I've approached the problem of theoretical virtues in a slightly different way. So I conducted an empirical study, a quantitative empirical study of scientists' view of theoretical virtues, and I contextualize that kind of work in work by, for example, James Beebe and Delson most recently on the realism debate, where they went out to interview or to do to study scientists' view or commitments with regards to realism. And yeah, you have Matic and Stolzner in a recent very nice paper on the standard model and various aspects of that and the development over time, and experimentalist theoreticians' commitments. But yeah, that already Carola Stotz in 2009 actually maybe was one of the first to try that kind of approach. And she actually took inspiration from experimental philosophy of science. So it's a little bit strange that experimental methods didn't make it so quickly into the philosophy of science. So you have them in, you have use of experimental methods already in the early 2000s, for example, by Edouard Machery and others. Of course, it's quite different, but still this quantitative empirical approach, that's something that Carola Stotz tried to bring into the philosophy of science. And she studied, for example, the concept of the species, and yeah, so she has a couple of papers on that. And unfortunately, she passed away recently. Okay, so here's an overview of what I want to talk about in this talk. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a bit about the purpose, maybe a bit more focused, and also then I'm going to talk about the survey design. How does the survey look like that I conducted? And I'm going to motivate the questions that I posed, and I'm going to present some of the questions in detail, and I'm going to give you the results, and we're going to have a discussion subsequently. Okay, so regarding the purpose and the focus of the study, so the study is exploratory, so it's exploration of scientists' view of some central philosophical questions about ethical virtues, but also it tries to compare those views to standard views in the philosophical literature, and to some of the views that I found in the philosophy subjects that I used, so philosophers. And the focus, yeah, I should say, is on theory, choice, and realism, and the questions that arise in these kinds of debates. And there are other things that you can ask, but I focused on these two things. You might ask, why should you conduct such a survey in the first place? So my view is that scientists are experts in handling scientific theories, and scientists' view are therefore interesting and important source of information about theoretical virtues. I think, yeah, that's kind of uncontroversial, that I guess that philosophers of science should try to make their views descriptively accurate. And there are several ways of doing that, and this is just another way. I take it to try to design or devise philosophical views that are descriptively accurate. And then, if scientists do not think how philosophers think they ought to think, I take it that philosophers may have to revisit some of their arguments and views. So there's no automatism here, of course, but I think that in principle, at least, those results could motivate philosophers to rethink some of their views. Okay. So this is the survey design here. I used the online platform Qualtrics, and I surveyed scientists and philosophers on a number of questions. I recruited the subjects by email. So I used several email lists. So for philosophers, I used PhilosL, Hopos, and the PSA email list, social media, and then I contacted science departments. And James Beebe was also kind enough to give me a number of contacts that he used for his study on realism. So that was very helpful. So the return was okay. So about 600 or 578 subjects I got, and 214 natural scientists, 278 social scientists, and about and 86 philosophers. The survey was pretty long, and unfortunately 226 subjects didn't finish the survey, maybe because it was pretty long. So it could have been maybe even, I could have even gotten better numbers with a better design. But anyway, so, and then also I should say that the biggest subgroup in the natural scientist group was physicists, and the social scientists, economists, for whatever reason. And the percentage was also perhaps, unsurprisingly, predominantly, so the subjects were predominantly male, reflecting the proportion, I guess, of the gender proportion in those fields. And then finally, the age distribution was this. So 40 from 88, sorry, from 38 years roughly to 49 years on average. Okay, and design, the survey design that I used was roughly the following. So the survey consists of 3 blocks of 5 plus 5 plus 3 questions. And I named them theories. So the sections: theory, simplicity, unification, and intuitions. And the questions that I used were Likert scale question types, ranking questions, multiple choice questions, but mostly Likert scale questions, 5-point Likert scale. And these are the topics. So I asked subjects about the purpose of theories, the ranking of virtues, the epistemicity of simplicity and unification, the potential, the nature of virtues, in particular simplicity, unification, and ad hocness, prediction versus explanation, aesthetics, and intuition. So a bunch of things. So again, possibly a little bit too much. But so in this talk, I'm focusing on the stuff that's underlined here. So ranking, epistemicity, nature of simplicity, and aesthetics. Actually, also I decided to not present the results because I don't have the time, I think. And then there was background questions in the survey before and after the survey. So yeah, a bunch of things. Okay, so I want to spend some time a little bit to talk about the motivations behind the questions that I posed, and that's going to be again on these topics here. So first of all, Kuhn argued that. So it's Kuhn in this famous paper that I mentioned. He argued that theory choice is pretty much an indeterminate matter. He says there's no algorithm for theory choice, and there's different ways of reading that, of course. And Okasha clarified that there's not a unique algorithm for theory choice. But yeah, so it's essentially what he thought was that, okay, there's this list of virtues that he thought was pretty universally accepted. Nevertheless, as he says, 2 men fully committed to the same list of criteria may nevertheless reach different conclusions as to what theory to choose, and that has to do with scientists having simply different preferences. So some scientists may prefer simpler theories, other may prefer more unified theories, and so on. And then, of course, an issue is, how does consensus form in science if that's the case? A pretty obvious solution would be, well, despite this diversity, maybe there's an overall preference order in the community. But that, of course, is an empirical question, and that's exactly the question that I tackled in the survey. The second topic that I tackled, or one of the topics that I tackled, is epistemicity. And Van Vrassen argued, of course, famously, quite some time back, that simplicity, in particular, and unifying power are pragmatic virtues. They have nothing to do with the truth content of a theory. They're not indicative of the truth of a theory. Rather, they are just pragmatic virtues. They have to do with the handling of the theories, what kind of cognitive preferences we have. But there's not more. There's not more to that. And there's quite a lot of people, I think, embracing that view. For example, my colleague Brad Ray in his recent book, Peter Etchenstein is in his book on speculation, Heather Douglas, and many others. And perhaps one should also say, so unifying power may strike one as maybe slightly awkward, but I think it makes sense to distinguish between a deflationary view of unification, where unification just means the accommodation of a lot of facts by the same theory, right? So such a theory could have a broad scope in that sense, in the sense that it just explains a lot of facts or accommodates a lot of facts. But there's another sense where which has to do with the unification of theoretical principles. Maxwell's electromagnetism is an example where two previously separate realms of the world were unified in this one theory. Okay, and then yeah, simplicity. So the nature of simplicity, more specifically, simplicity is often criticized as being too vague, theory choice criterion, and McAllister has a good discussion of that in his book from the late 90s. And a couple of things that you can wonder about with regards to what scientists might think is, what kinds of theories do scientists conceive of as simple, and what kinds of simplicity might they prefer over others? If they do have a preference, then maybe the vagueness of simplicity is not so much problematic. And finally, aesthetics. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that theoretical virtues are perceived as aesthetical by scientists, and that they even are considered as truth tracking. So Einstein is an example. He's said to have considered theory's aesthetical appeal more important than its empirical adequacy. You also find it in McAllister. Yeah, Ivano has done some nice work, Milena Ivanova, and but most of the evidence, as far as I'm aware, is really anecdotal evidence, evidence from specific historical episodes, perhaps specific scientists. And then an obvious question is, well, how typical are such sentiments in the scientific community? And that's also a question that I tackled. Okay. Right. So let's move on to the questions that I posed and the results that I obtained. And I'm going to focus on ranking and epistemicity because because I don't think I'll have the time, but you can press me on those in the Q&A if you want to, of the other aspects, simplicity and aesthetics. Okay, so one of the questions that I asked was this one: please rank the following statements in the order of importance to you. So first, the most important, and sixth, the least important. And that was actually a question where you could drag and drop the statements, and then they what the subjects got was this one: a good scientific theory should be accurate with regards to all the relevant data, be simple, externally consistent, internally consistent, accurately predict phenomena that weren't known before the theory was devised, unify phenomena prior to the theory, appear to be unconnected. So these are, of course, yeah, the virtues, the classical virtues. And then we, on the basis of the results, I, with a student assistant, determined the Condorcet winner for each of the groups. So basically, the virtue that in a direct comparison with the other virtues won out overall. And you can see here for the philosopher group, internal consistency won all the contests, accuracy 4, predictive power 3, unifying power 2, external consistency 1, and simplicity 0. And then, yeah, it's interesting because you can see that there was quite some agreement across the groups, not only between the scientists, but also between the scientists and the philosophers of how to rank the virtues. At least the first two are the same. Then we have predictive power for philosophers and the natural scientists, And for social sciences, we actually have a tie between predictive power and unifying power. And then we get unifying power on the two other groups, philosophers and natural scientists. And maybe the biggest disagreement is here in the end. So philosophers unsurprisingly ranked simplicity, or simplicity has had the fewest wins, namely 0, whereas in the science groups, the external consistency fared even worse. What we also did was to look at the more detailed profiles that we got. So what you see in this diagram is the percentage of subjects, in this case social scientists, ranking a particular virtue on a particular rank. So here on the x-axis you see that the ranks, 1 is the highest rank to 6 lowest rank. And the social scientists group, internal consistency really was ranked first, as you can see here, by a big margin. So roughly 50% versus 20% for the next highest, or for the next virtue that was ranked first, namely accuracy. And external consistency is ranked last, or by a big margin, again, 56 to 20%, 20% being simplicity, the blue one. Yeah, and the same we did for the natural scientists, and it looks a bit different, as you can see. The external consistency was not a clear winner for the 6th place. So simplicity was pretty close to that. And for the philosophers, simplicity was more than 55%, so 57% ranked simplicity on the last rank. All right. Let's move on to epistemicity. And I said I posed 2 questions for epistemicity. So the first one is the following. Please indicate your disagreement with the following statements. My confidence that a theory is correct is increased, everything else being equal, when a theory unifies phenomena previously thought to be unrelated. And then they had to indicate their agreement on a 5-point Likert scale. And then they got the second question, so my confidence that the theory is correct is increased, blah, 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 when the theory is simple. And the motivation for the specific formulation was that if the virtues were pragmatic, then they shouldn't raise confidence, because they have nothing to do with the truth content of the theory. They just have to do with the way we handle them. And here's the result. So you can see the Likert scale from 1 to 5, 5 being strongly agree, 1 being strongly disagree. Yellow stands for philosophers, blue for natural scientists, and red for social scientists. You can see up here the averages for each of the groups. So Q1 is unification, Q2 is simplicity. And obviously, unification robustly increases confidence for all 3 groups. And natural scientists are more likely to agree than social scientists, but the effect size is small. Simplicity, so philosophers are not different from the midpoint here. So we did a test for that as well. So they're not significantly different from the responses. Natural scientists and social sciences are more likely to agree. But of course, the level of agreement is much lower for simplicity than it is for unification. And then again, you can do more detailed analysis, and we did that for each of the questions, and the ones that stuck out, I'm going to talk about a little bit. So this one is for the simplicity question, and as you can see, that there's a large subgroup of scientists agreeing with the statement that simplicity raises confidence. 50% of natural scientists agreeing versus 20% disagreeing, and similar with the social scientists. With the philosophers, it's actually pretty equal, right? 33 agreeing and 30% disagreeing. So I thought that was just interesting to highlight, because the averages by themselves, of course, mask these more detailed results, and the midpoint of the Likert scale is notoriously problematic, so it's not quite clear what it actually means, whether it's whether people choose because they don't know or because they genuinely are torn between the choices. But so this was one question that I used to get to the potential epistemicity of virtues, and another one was this year, and this needs a little bit of further motivation. So the leading idea for that was that if theoretical virtues are truth conducive, then the virtues theory's conflict with the data may or should be acceptable. And then Frassen actually talks about this in his book, and he has the following to say on that. This can surely not be so when the other virtue is the one the non-realist regards the highest, namely empirical adequacy. For to forgo empirical adequacy is to allow that there may arise inconsistencies with the observed facts. That possibility we cannot allow while advocating the theory as correct. And I actually make that the subject of one of my chapters in the book if you're interested. Okay, and then on the basis of this idea, I formulate the following question. Please indicate your disagreement or agreement or disagreement with the following statements. It's acceptable for a theory to be in conflict with some of the relevant data when a theory unifies phenomena previously thought to be unrelated. That's unification. And the second one was when it's acceptable for a theory to be in conflict with some of the relevant data when the theory is simple. And finally, it's not at all acceptable for a theory to be in conflict with any of the relevant data. This is the result. So unifying power here, the first columns, the second simplicity, and then unacceptable. And here are the averages again in this table. So the natural scientists for the first question, they are at the midpoint of the scale. Philosophers and social scientists are more likely to accept such conflicts. So conflicts between a unifying theory and the relevant data. But the effect sizes, the differences between the groups are again small. Simplicity, the result is the following. Social scientists are more likely to accept such conflicts than philosophers and natural scientists. But all groups are different from the midpoint. So philosophers and natural scientists actually disagree that that's acceptable when you have such a theory conflicting with the data. Are conflicts unacceptable? So here, social scientists and philosophers disagreed. They're less likely than natural scientists to agree, and natural scientists were actually at the midpoint of the scale. Okay, and again, you can look at the more detailed profile. This is for the unification question, and you can see that it's quite interesting that you have this one group, a substantial subgroup that's actually, quite strongly in agreement here. So the level of agreement is this. So you have 63% agreeing. So if you summarize the two ends of the scale, so if you summarize the strong and the weak agreement or disagreement, that's what you end up. So so disregarding the midpoint of the scale, you get 63 agreement, 26 disagree. For the natural scientists, 50 agree, 34 disagree, and similar for the social scientists. And the final question also looked different. It's interesting when you looked at it in more detail, because you get this extreme divide. So you have very few subjects actually going for the middle, and then you have philosophers mostly disagreeing with the statement. So most of them think there are a situation where it's acceptable that you have this conflict between the theory and the evidence. And that's yeah, that is reflected in the other responses too. Interestingly, yeah, sorry, that's what I said, and that's what I wanted to get to. So there's also an open question on where subjects could just say when what they thought wasn't covered in the prompt. So this question was, are there any other situation where you can imagine conflicts to be acceptable? And the three most important responses were the data may turn out to be unreliable or untrustworthy. There's reason to doubt the data. That was the most frequent response. All theories are idealizations, can never explain all the data, reality is too complex. And theory successfully explains important or more facts and fails to accommodate only less important and few facts. So these are my paraphrases, of course, but they roughly capture what the subject said in this frequency, as you can see here in the brackets. Yeah, most interestingly, maybe there was no mention of any other virtue where the subjects thought that conflict was acceptable. To summarize this, so there's so I had these two questions on epistemicity, right? One was about confidence raising, and for the unification, for the virtue of unification, all groups agree that unification raises their confidence, everything else being the same or being equal. Simplicity, the scientists tend to agree with this, and we looked at the more detailed profile where you see the majority percentage actually agreeing, whereas the philosophers neither agree nor disagree. With conflicts, with the conflict question, it looks a bit different. You also have this agreement amongst social scientists and philosophers, and a majority percentage agreeing in all of the groups. And then you have simplicity, where natural scientists and philosophers actually tend to disagree, versus where social scientists tend to agree. Okay, so I take it to be strong evidence that unification is viewed as an epistemic virtue, and that there's evidence from the confidence question that simplicity is viewed as an epistemic virtue by scientists, with social scientists having actually more robust views than the natural scientists, which is reflected in them actually agreeing also in the conflicts question, whereas you don't have that. Whereas that's not the case for the natural scientists. But I'm going to say a little bit more about this kind of interpretation in the end. Yeah, so that's actually the conclusions already coming up. Maybe I was a little bit faster than I thought, but yeah, we can still look at the other details, other results if you're interested before or after discussion. So the leading question was, do scientists think what philosophers think they ought to think? And I think there's the survey, the study that I did provides some good news. So there's lots of agreement. And I think it's fair to say that philosophers are mostly descriptively accurate. But there's also some surprising agreement and some less surprising disagreement. So the surprising agreement, I think regards or concerns the ranking question, where you have across the three groups actually quite strong agreement or consistency in the way that the virtues were ranked, and that's also good. Yeah, that's good news for philosophers. That may have been something that you may have not predicted. Maybe you found yourself sympathetic with the Kuhnian view, but that's certainly something that I didn't expect, and that's good. And there's also there's an overall preference order of virtues, I think we can say, in the scientific community based on these results, and that means, of course, that the Kuhnian picture of theory choice may be too pessimistic, right? Kuhn thinks that theory choice is indeterminate because scientists have all these different preferences. and then it's a little bit of a mystery how we actually get to agreement. But if you look at these results, then it seems that actually it's not such a big mystery, because simply because scientists, they have a pretty clear overall preference order. So when they have to consider a theory that is consistent versus one that is not, then they will go for the one that is consistent. Of course, if they have a theory that is consistent but not accurate, that they might prefer the so that they should rank this consistency concern over the accuracy concern according to this result. Less surprising disagreement, I think, comes from this epistemicity question. So we have scientists viewing unifying power as an epistemic virtue. I think there's pretty strong support for that, but I also think there's some, of course, much weaker evidence that simplicity is an epistemic virtue, and philosophers seem to disagree, at least with regards to simplicity. And you could also see that in the ranking question, right, where philosophers ranked simplicity at the very bottom, and the scientists also ranked simplicity low, but not as low as the philosophers did, and not as extremely maybe. And I think, so the results, of course, don't determine any particular philosophical view, but I think they can motivate certain views. And what I think is a possibility or possible resolution of this result would be to say that the virtues need not be either epistemic or pragmatic, but they could be epistemic to one degree or another. So simplicity could be epistemic, but just weakly epistemic. And you can think of that in terms of probability raising. And that's actually something that I have suggested in my book, if you're interested. But I think that will be a possible way to go from here. Just to mention the other results briefly that I got. I had a bunch of questions on the nature of simplicity, and asked them about, when would they conceive of a theory as simple, when the theories postulate basic things, a few basic things, few principles, or a few free parameters. And there was actually agreement with all of these things, but there was strong agreement with syntactic parsimony, so few principles, then with ontological parsimony, so postulating few basic things. And that could be interesting because philosophers have focused a lot on ontological parsimony, and in particular quantitative ontological parsimony. For example, Janssen and Talent have a paper on that. But it looks as though that syntactic parsimony may be actually something that scientists care more about than ontological parsimony. And then it's a bit surprising that the discussion is in a different place. And finally, aesthetics. Scientists, sort of my result was that scientists actually view several theoretical virtues as aesthetical, simplicity, unifying power, non-ad hocness, and as well, and free parameters, or the paucity of free parameters, I should say. And philosophers largely agree with that. That's also good. But there's actually even some evidence that scientists consider aesthetical judgments as truth tracking, and that I determined by trying to look for correlations between some of the questions. We found a correlation between the aesthetic questions. So agreement with the aesthetic questions correlated with agreement with one of the epistemicity questions, namely the confidence raising and the conflicts for simple theories. But you got that only for the scientists and not the philosophers, if I remember correctly. Okay, so this is my final slide. Where do we go from here? So I think so my study provides a systematic description of scientists' view of some important philosophical questions about theoretical virtues in science. And I viewed the data that I obtained as an interesting, important addition to other kinds of data we possess. And I think this extension of the database constitutes a new starting point for discussions. And I've made already a couple of suggestions where you could take some of those results philosophically. But yeah, it's not, of course, the results by themselves are not the end point of discussion. And with that, I think we can go into the Q&A. Oh, yeah, finally, I should say, acknowledgement. Yeah, so this is Christopher Lundbeck, who helped a lot with the statistics, and my wife as well, actually, who's a social scientist. And the research was also supported by a sub-priority grant from the Independent Research Fund in Denmark.
Cool, thanks so much, Sam. That was really fascinating. So we will take a 5-minute break just for people to formulate questions, go to the toilet, get a drink or whatever. So we'll reconvene at 18 minutes past 1.
Okay.
If you do have, we'll prioritize student questions. So if you just put Q in the chat for questions for students first, feel free to just jump in now, and then we can start again at 18 minutes past.
Okay.